So we all kind of have at least one issue with the new monster manual, and that's fair. There's a couple of things that are unnecessary in it. But that doesn't mean that we as dungeon masters can start slacking off for our players when it comes to monsters, right? It's one of those things where it can be difficult to try and keep players engaged with certain monsters, especially when we keep throwing the same thing at them. And that's one of the great things about the new monster manual is a lot of the subsections that are common, like goblins and vampires, unfortunately, have more. There's now more than just goblins. There's the goblin chief, the goblin assassin. There's like 4 or 5 different flavors of goblin now. So even though it's goblins, which everyone's used to early game, early campaign, it's different flavors. It's different. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about today is ways to keep your players interested in the monsters with or without combat, right? There's so many things that I've seen it by watching podcasts, by listening to podcasts, watching people play on YouTube, and even on the very, very rare chance I get to be a player, Dungeon Masters are missing the mark when it comes to monsters. There are a couple things you can do to keep your players entertained, and players, don't be afraid to ask your Dungeon Masters for these things. So one thing that the new Monster Manual does really well, in my opinion, is, and this is going to be a controversial take, but the lore. Every monster now has a fair amount of lore in the Monster Manual. Before, they didn't all, and most of them did, but sometimes they just throw a name in there with a stat block, wouldn't even get a picture, good luck, right? Now, every monster has detailed pictures, but they have lore. They have some form of background on the monster so that you can better pick the area that they're found in. Your players run into them, and you can better depict the area, the lifestyle that they're living, right? That's something that's going to be super helpful in drawing your players in, making them decide whether or not they even want to do this combat, if it's an optional combat, So lore is always something it's super interesting and it's fun, and it's something that you can give your players when they attempt to do a history check or a knowledge check on this monster. Should they roll high enough, you can give them this super interesting lore. Now, another thing is, I'm going to have to move right here to make this legible. Kind of. Descriptions. Now, descriptions are easy and hard at the same time, right? They are super important. Whether you're describing the silhouette because they see the monster at night, or you're giving them a vivid description, a vivid, you're painting them a picture. It's important. Okay, sometimes, they're gonna know, and it might cause some metagaming, and that's okay, right? As long as your players know that metagaming is not allowed because it takes a lot of the fun out of it, they'll know what monster it is personally, but their characters won't. And it's a great way to instill fear in your new players when you're describing something like an aboleth, right? It's great. And with the new pictures, the updated art, everything has this nice, vivid, sometimes scary, sometimes cute look to it. So you have no excuse for not being able to give a fantastic description for the monster in question, because descriptors are key. You have to remember that, whether it's slimy, whether it's viscous, it's dry, it's scaly, descriptors are key, okay? And here's the thing. I still firmly believe, and a lot of you will disagree with me, I know a lot of my friends do, humanoid, in my opinion, does not belong as a monster classification. And the reason for that is there are so many monsters that are humanoid shaped, and that causes confusion. You can use humanoid as a descriptor, but you have to be careful. because it's going to confuse your veteran players. So knowing which descriptors you can use for certain monsters and which ones you can't is important, but luckily for you, the pictures will help you with that. So those are two important things. Another big thing is when you get to the BBEG or even a mid-tier boss, right, that has legendary actions, right? Legendary actions are super important. A lot of people forget about them because, it's not the BBEG, so it shouldn't have legendary actions. It's something they chanced upon. Look, I don't care. I don't care what it is. All right. If it's got a legendary action, aboleths have legendary actions. They are not the strongest monster in the monster manual. I wouldn't use one as a BBEG. I would use one as like a mid-campaign boss personally, but it still has legendary actions. Legendary actions are super important because they keep the combat fresh, right? A lot of DMs either forget about them or refuse to use them because it makes it harder. Sometimes it does, but it keeps it interesting. A little bit of challenge, a little bit of difficulty is okay. It really is. You don't want to coddle your players so much that they're getting bored with your combat, but you also don't want to make it so incredibly difficult that they can't keep up with your combat. You have to find the middle ground. And that middle ground is going to be different depending on how long your players have been playing. Veteran players, more veteran players can handle a far more challenging combat difficulty than, say, Joe Schmo that just started playing, a month and a half ago, has a total of 6 sessions under their belt, right? Because they're still learning. I mean, everyone is constantly learning because this game is constantly changing. Even when it doesn't change, it's still changing. There's always new ways to play. There's always new things you can do, right? Everyone's constantly coming up with new homebrew rules, especially when the edition in question has been out for a while. We don't have a whole lot of homebrew rules for 1D&D yet, or 6th edition or 5.5, whatever you personally are calling it. It's still so new, we don't have a whole lot of homebrew rules for it, but give it time, we will, I promise. It's just the way of things. So you got to remember legendary actions. Know when to use them, remember they're there because it's always fun. Now going back to the Aboleth, right? The Aboleth has legendary actions, but it also has layer actions. And yes, I know my handwriting is atrocious because I'm trying to write it quickly. Don't come at me in the comments for that. Somebody already has. Yeah, I know. I've got a doctor's handwriting without the PhD. It's okay. Layer actions. Layer actions are so cool. Not a lot of monsters in the Monster Manual have layers. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that. More monsters in the Monster Manual have layers than they did in the 2014 Monsters Manual. It's less than half, right? I want to say like 15% of the monsters. I don't know. I haven't gone through every single page of that book yet. It's enormous. And I have a full-time job. So not every single monster has a layer action. Not every single monster has a layer per se. Every monster has a domicile, a biome that they live in, an area that they would live in. But not every monster gets layer actions for that. Most dragons get layer actions. In fact, I believe all dragons get layer actions because they have layers. The Aboleth has layer actions. The Vampire Lord has layer actions, just to rattle off a few. Layer actions are really cool because, well, you get to describe a new setting, a new area, right? Something that is personal to this particular entry in the Monster Manual. And I don't like vampires, right? I've made that abundantly clear. It's not that I dislike vampires. I think they're overused and whatever. But the vampire layers are so cool. I use them every chance I get, but I don't use vampires a lot. But they're so cool. They're so great to describe this gothic mansion that is equal parts cool and creepy. It's fantastic. And like the Aboleth is usually in a cave with water, and it's equal parts slimy and wet and spooky and creepy because it's an eldritch horror. Like, for those of you who haven't read, the Cthulhu books, it's a tentacle monster, right? It's so fun. Layers in general are fun, and I can't stress that out enough. Now, keep in mind, your veteran players know better. They're not going to want to fight these monsters in the lair. So if you want to use the lair, you're going to have to figure out a way to get them to go in. I can't really help you with that because I have a hard enough time with that as it is. But lairs are cool. Never forget to include the layers and describe them well. You want to paint a picture in your players' minds. That is one of the most important things as a dungeon master, to be able to paint that picture for them, because this is a story that we're telling. And what's a story without pictures, right? Now, obviously, this is all my opinion. I personally think it's correct. But if you disagree with me, or if you've got something that you think I should add to this list, because I'm sure I'm missing something, 4 things, that's a short list for me, right? You guys are used to me putting, 15 items on a list. But those are, in my opinion, the most important things to keep in mind going into this new edition of Dungeons and Dragons, to keep your players interested in the monsters, because you can't have Dungeons and Dragons without the monsters. They are one of the most important things in the game. So, if you liked what I had to say, if you didn't like what I had to say, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. And, as always, thanks for watching.